If you're a fan of Avatar, Lord of the Rings, or Star Trek, then you've encountered a constructed language. But what does that mean? What makes a language constructed? Why do people dedicate years of their life to a craft that most lay people are unfamiliar with? And why do constructed languages matter? Welcome to WordBrain. I'm Hannah, and today we're going to learn what makes constructed languages so cool. To start off with, I have to give a huge shout out to David J. Peterson, the mind behind approximately 50 conlangs in over 24 movies and TV shows, including Dothraki and High Valyrian from Game of Thrones, Ravkan from Shadow and Bone, and Chakobusuk from Dune. He has a YouTube channel where he goes way more in depth on the process of creating a conlang than I ever could here. And he wrote this book, The Art of Language Invention. I picked this book up knowing nothing about constructed languages, and by the end of the semester I had read it cover to cover, and following his instructions, created a language with one of my best friends. I'll link all of his stuff in the description. If you're even mildly interested in conlanging, I heartily recommend you check him out. So, let's get into this. What is a constructed language? Well, a helpful definition can be found in its name. Constructed languages are languages created intentionally by a handful of people for a certain purpose. This doesn't mean much in a vacuum, of course, so let's contrast that with natural languages. These evolve over time through use by a large speaker population and are used for the general purpose of communication. English, for example, is a natural language. It evolved spontaneously from a root language thousands of years ago, and will continue to evolve because of collective and unconscious influence by millions of speakers. Of course, people coin words on purpose all the time, but those account for a minority of words in English, and even those words evolve naturally after they're introduced to the lexical arena. Dothraki, as a contrasting example, is a language constructed by David Peterson, originally based on material by George R. R. Martin for the purpose of entertainment and world building in the Game of Thrones series. So that's a functional definition of conlangs, but it's very static. A language created by people for a purpose. Who are the people? What's the purpose? Well, that depends. So far, all the conlangs we've talked about have been fictional and were created to enhance audience immersion and deepen world building in a fictional setting. These are often called artistic languages, or artlangs for short. By their entertainment nature, these are the most visible type of conlangs, but they're far from the only subtype. Lots of languages have been invented to play around with philosophical ideas. For example, Suzette Hayden Elgin created her conlang, Ladon, to explore issues of feminism from an experimental and creative linguistic perspective. Granted, she did include this language in her science fiction series Native Tongue. The lines between the conlang categories are fuzzy through no fault of their own. Ladon is a philosophical conlang, part of a category called engineered languages, or englangs. There are lots of different types of englangs that, frankly, I don't have the time to get into, but a good rule of thumb is that englangs are typically created as a kind of thought experiment. People also make conlangs for practical purposes. Typically, they're intended for international communication. The most famous of these, and one of the most famous conlangs in general, is Esperanto, which was created by L.L. Zamenhof to serve as a, quote, universal second language and a fair communication tool. While it hasn't united every speaker on Earth, as Zamenhof may have hoped, Esperanto has experienced quite a bit of success. According to Babbel, approximately 2 million people speak Esperanto today, and about 1,000 of those are native speakers. Languages intended to serve a practical purpose like this are called auxiliary languages, or auxlangs. So now we know what conlangs are and why people create them. Congrats! You have a deeper understanding of the theory behind constructed languages than you did at the beginning of this video. But that's just theoretical, and in my opinion, the best way to truly understand conlanging is to get our hands dirty. So, let's make a conlang. I decided to make an artlang for some fictional creatures, but you can follow this example to make any type of language your heart desires. The sequence I'm following here is inspired by Peterson's The Art of Language Invention. So if you're interested in more depth on this process, I'd highly recommend getting your hands on a copy. Let's start with our speakers. Today, I'm designing a language for a species of lizard people that live in an underground system of caves filled with mushrooms and crystals. Factors like your speaker's environment or physical characteristics can have a profound impact on their language. For example, my lizard people don't have any lips, which will add some fun challenges to our sound inventory, and they have skinny tongues. which could increase the distribution of lateral sounds like "ul," where the air flows out the sides of the mouth. Their caves are echoey, which I want to keep in mind when choosing sounds, and they have low vision, which could have an interesting effect on vocabulary. Okay, I think that's enough to get us started. Let's pick some sounds. When choosing sounds for your language, the International Phonetic Alphabet is going to be your best friend. It's a system for categorizing all of the sounds in all of the languages in the world. When you write something in IPA, there's a 1-to-1 correlation. Every symbol corresponds to exactly one sound, and every sound corresponds to exactly one symbol. I'll link one of my favorite clickable IPA charts below. When I'm developing a new language, I love clicking around, hearing sounds that aren't in my native language, and finding out what sticks for the language I'm designing. In this case, we can narrow our options a little bit. Since our lizard speakers don't have lips, their language can't include bilabial or labial dental consonants or rounded vowels. So that means we don't have sounds like b, m, f, or u. Now that we've set up our options, it's important to remember that, in general, sounds in a language are as different from each other as possible, and relatively spread out across the IPA charts. With that in mind, I want to start with vowels. I want to keep this system pretty simple, so I'm going to pick one vowel from each of the 4 corners of the vowel space. E is my high front vowel, U is my high back, A is my low front, and A is my low back. Now it's time for consonants. I want to lean into lateral sounds because of those skinny tongues, and I'm thinking it could be fun to include only voiced sounds for cave echo reasons. So here's what I've got. The alveolar stop, D. The uvular stop, G. The alveolar nasal, N. The palatal nasal, N. The alveolar fricative, S. The post-alveolar fricative, J. The uvular fricative, R. The alveolar lateral fricative, L. The post-alveolar lateral approximant, L. The palatal lateral approximant, Y. And the alveolar lateral click. When I'm constructing words, I'm going to use a CVC structure. That's consonant, vowel, consonant, and avoid consonant clusters so that those vowels can resonate and carry through the tongues. Also, I'm going to create words that are stressed on the first and third syllables, like English. If you want your conlang to have tonality, this is a great time to figure that out, but that's not something I want to use for this language. Okay, now that we've got our sounds sorted, it's time to start building words. We've got a lot to consider here, starting from the simplest question. What is a word? In English, a word contains a small particle of meaning that can be altered with an affix. Think blue and bluest. But some languages, like Turkish, are agglutinative, so the meaning that would be carried in a sentence in English is all in one word with lots of affixes. For the sake of this video, I'm going to stick closer to English forms, but feel free to play around with different language types in your own conlang experiments. Now, let's consider how nouns change across our language. In English, pronouns change based on their position in the sentence. She stole the ball versus I passed the ball to her, for example. English doesn't do this with nouns in general. Instead, we understand the noun's role based on its order in a sentence. But lots of languages do include affixes for this process, called nominal inflection. These systems can encompass a lot of different things, but the most common are subject and object. Number is a more obvious one. Except in irregular cases, in English, the singular is unmarked and the plural has an S. Lots of languages have other number distinctions. Rather than one and more than one, they'll distinguish one, few, and many, or other combinations. Finally, we have noun class. You may have encountered this system in the form of grammatical gender if you've ever learned a language like French, Spanish, or German. Another type of noun class is animacy, which classifies nouns based on how alive they are. There are other noun classes as well, and this is a really fun factor to get creative with, as long as you remember that some assignments to class will make semantic sense and others won't. Let's apply these features to our conlang. I'm going to leave off any nominal inflection affixes and instead let word order mark that. I love using a couple different distinctions for number, so let's use the prefix a for singular, u for few, and e for many. Since our lizard people have low vision, I think a fun noun class would be bright versus dark. Let's use the suffix as for bright and al for dark. We've got our nouns figured out. Let's move on to verbs. In almost any language, verbs are the most complicated category because they're the most likely to change based on their surroundings. First of all, verbs often agree with the nominal inflection we just talked about in one or all categories, like person, number, and gender. If you've ever done conjugation tables in a language class, you are making those verbs agree with their subjects in person and number. In English, this shows up in situations like I swim versus he swims. That's a difference in person. But verbs also change on their own to show tense or relationship to time. Think present tense he swims versus past tense he swam. If you're an English speaker, you might think of tense as simply past, present, and future, but this system is super unique in language systems across the world, so feel free to get creative here. Verbs can also be altered based on aspect, or how they're presented, and modality, the speaker's viewpoint. The perfect versus progressive are examples of aspect in English. I cooked versus I was cooking, and we use auxiliary verbs like should or could for modality. As you might be able to tell, there's a lot more complexity here, but this basic knowledge is enough to help us make some words. For tense, I've decided to use past, present, future, and constant, which could in some irregular cases be combined with one of the other three tenses, as well as agreement with the dark or bright case of the noun. In this case, our past morpheme is in, our present morpheme is al, our future morpheme is ad, and our constant morpheme is na. Our bright morpheme is e, and our dark morpheme is u. So we've sorted out our nominal inflection and our verbal inflection. It's finally time to make some words. This is my favorite part of the process. I love mixing together the sounds I carefully chose and seeing what words stick. To decide on the vocabulary you're going to work with, think about what concepts would come up frequently for your speakers, or even about some concepts and words you might want to translate. Here's my list, and here's how I translated them. Now it's time to take those words and put them into phrases. There's one last decision we need to make. What will be the order of our language? English has a word order of subject, verb, object, or SVO. All possible combinations exist in natural languages, but starting with the object is pretty uncommon. I think for my conlang, I'm going to use the VSO word order, which happens to be the same as Hawaiian. Now that we have all of our details in place and all of our decisions made, let's put it all into practice with the phrase, the people will run home. We'll start with the English sentence at the bottom and then write a gloss above it. This is basically just a boiled down version of each word in the target language order and including all inflectional categories. In this case, we'll start with the verb run and mark it as future and bright, agreeing with our subject. Next is person, which will mark as few and bright. And then it's home, which is singular and dark. We know from our word generation earlier that vil is the root of run. And for a future bright verb, we add the suffix adi. Then person is digan, with a prefix u for few, and a suffix az for bright. Finally, home is le, with prefix a for singular, and suffix al for dark. So altogether, the phrase, the people will run home, can be translated to Riladi Uduganes Aleal. And that's it. Now we've barely scratched the surface here. There are still so many parts of speech and interesting constructions to play around with, plus phonetic and syntactic irregularities, the evolution of sounds, words, and phrases, and we haven't even talked about writing systems. But now you know the basics of how to create a constructed language, and you know where and how to look if you want to take things further. Ultimately, making a conlang is my favorite way to turn the science of linguistics on its head and inject some creativity into a very rule and theory-based domain. Conlangs can help you become familiar with language in a hands-on, concrete way, and can teach you the principles of linguistics from the ground up. And they're fun. Conlangs are cool. This is art, and sometimes that's all you need.